The crack of thunder shattered the stillness of the Colorado afternoon as Quentin Kerrigan stood at the edge of his barren land, watching helplessly as lightning split the sky over the drought-stricken pastures of his once thriving ranch. It had been 3 years since rain had properly blessed his property outside St. Elmo, and 2 years since the death of his wife had left him alone to face the slow death of everything he had built. The year was 1883, and while other parts of the West flourished with new settlements and railroad expansions, Quentin's world had shrunk to counting each living head of cattle and praying for clouds that brought more than just shadows. "Not today either," he muttered, pulling his worn hat lower as the thunderstorm taunted him, rumbling overhead but refusing to deliver its precious cargo of water. His cattle, once numbering in the hundreds, had dwindled to a meager 35, their ribs visible beneath dusty hides as they searched the parched earth for sustenance. Quentin turned his back on the empty promise of rain and began the trek to his cabin, his boots kicking up puffs of the dry soil that had once grown sweet grass. At 40 years old, the lines etching his sun-weathered face told the story of a man who had seen too much hardship. His broad shoulders, once held proudly, now carried the invisible weight of impending failure. The interior of his cabin was as stark as the land outside, neat but lifeless, like everything else in his world since Mariah had succumbed to fever. A half-empty bottle of whiskey waited on the table, his only companion during the long, silent evenings. Tonight, however, he left it untouched. Tomorrow he would ride to town for supplies, and he needed a clear head for the journey. Morning brought a harsh sun and no relief from the heat that had plagued the region. Quentin saddled his mare, a sturdy chestnut named Penny, and set off for the 10-mile ride to St. Elmo. The town had grown since he'd first settled in the area 15 years before, the silver mines bringing prosperity that had somehow bypassed his cattle ranch. The main street bustled with activity: miners, merchants, and ladies in fine dresses who turned curious eyes to the tall, somber rancher as he dismounted in front of the general store. Quentin nodded politely, but kept his interactions brief. Since Mariah's death, the art of conversation had become as foreign to him as the sound of laughter. Kerrigan, Henry Mason, the storekeeper, greeted him with familiarity as he entered the establishment. "Thought you might have packed up and headed east by now. And leave all this." Quentin gestured vaguely to the window, his attempt at humor falling flat. "Just the usual supplies today, Henry." As Mason gathered flour, coffee, and ammunition, he cleared his throat. "Heard you might be interested. There's a wagon train stopped on the edge of town. Family came in yesterday. Husband died on the trail, cholera. Left his wife and her sister with 5 young ones between them. They're looking to settle, might be willing to work." Quentin shook his head. "I can barely feed myself, let alone 2 women and a pack of children." Mason shrugged. "Just thought I'd mention it. They seem capable enough. The wife, Abigail Jones, is her name. She was apparently helping her husband run a farm back in Missouri. Sisters called Amanda. Pretty things, both of them, though they're in a bad way now." "I'm not looking for pretty things," Quentin said firmly, counting out coins for his purchases. "Just rain." "Well, one might be easier to come by than the other," Mason replied with a chuckle that Quentin didn't return. After loading his supplies, Quentin found himself inexplicably drawn toward the edge of town where the broken-down wagon sat forlornly beside a makeshift camp. He told himself he was merely curious, perhaps sympathetic to their plight, but nothing more. He had no room in his life for complications. As he approached, he saw a woman kneeling beside the wagon wheel, attempting to repair a broken spoke with tools too large for her delicate hands. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and even from a distance, he could see the determination in her posture. "You'll need a proper woodworking tool for that," he said, startling her as he dismounted. She looked up, revealing a face that might have been pretty had it not been etched with grief and exhaustion. "Do you have one I could borrow?" "No, madam," he admitted. "But I know how to fix it without one." She stood brushing dust from her plain calico dress. "I'd be grateful for the help, Mr. Kerrigan, Quentin Kerrigan." He removed his hat, a courtesy he'd almost forgotten. "And you must be Mrs. Jones." "Abigail Jones," she confirmed, offering a hand that was surprisingly strong. "Though I suppose now I'm just Miss Jones again." Before he could respond, a second woman emerged from the wagon, a child of about 3 balanced on her hip. The resemblance to Abigail was unmistakable, the same dark hair and clear blue eyes, though this woman's face held less hardness, more openness. "Amanda," Abigail introduced her. "My sister." "Amanda, this is Mr. Kerrigan." "Pleased to meet you," Amanda said, her voice softer than her sister's. The toddler on her hip buried his face in her shoulder shyly. "Mr. Kerrigan has offered to help with the wheel," Abigail explained. "I didn't actually," Quentin began, then stopped himself as 4 more children of varying ages appeared from behind the wagon, their faces dirty but curious. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10, a boy with serious eyes that reminded Quentin painfully of the son he and Mariah had never had. "These are my 2, Abigail gestured to the oldest boy and a girl of about 8. "James and Sarah." "And Amanda's 3, she pointed to a pair of twin girls about 6 years old and the toddler boy. "Emma and Elizabeth," Amanda supplied. "And this little one is David." Quentin suddenly felt overwhelmed. He hadn't been around children in years, had forgotten how directly they stared, how much space they seemed to take up despite their small size. "Let me see about that wheel," he said gruffly, turning away from the expectant faces. As he worked on the damaged wagon, he learned their story in pieces. Abigail's husband Robert had been a farmer who'd lost his land to debt after 3 failed harvests. Amanda had been widowed 2 years prior when her husband was killed in a hunting accident. They had pooled their resources to journey west, hoping to claim land under the Homestead Act, but Robert's death had left them stranded with dwindling funds and no clear direction. "We were heading to California," Abigail explained as she held the wheel steady for him. "But now I'm not sure what's best. California's a long way with a broken wagon and no man," Quentin said, immediately regretting his bluntness when he saw her face tighten. "We don't need a man to tell us where to go," she replied, her blue eyes flashing. "Just a working wagon to get there." Quentin raised an eyebrow at her spirit. "No offense intended, madam, just stating facts." Amanda approached with a cup of water for him, her manner more conciliatory than her sister's. "We're grateful for your help, Mr. Kerrigan. We've had little enough of it since Robert passed." He accepted the water, noticing the way the afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair. Both sisters were in their late 20s, he guessed, though hardship had aged Abigail beyond her years. The wheel repair took the better part of an hour, and by the time he finished, the sun was lowering in the sky. The thought of the long ride back to his empty ranch suddenly seemed unbearable. "You folks have plans for tonight?" he found himself asking. "We'll camp here again," Abigail answered, wary of his question. Quentin cleared his throat. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles east. It's not much these days, droughts hit us hard, but I've got shelter and clean water. You're welcome to it for a night or 2 while you figure out your next move." The sisters exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Finally, Amanda spoke. "That's very kind, Mr. Kerrigan, but we wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," he said, surprising himself with his insistence. Truth be told, the place could use some life in it. After a whispered conference, Abigail faced him with decided practicality. "We accept on one condition. We work for our keep cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. We're not charity cases." "Fair enough," Quentin agreed, oddly relieved by her terms. "Can you handle a team of horses?" "Better than most men," she said without a hint of boasting. And so it was decided. They loaded their few possessions onto the repaired wagon, and with Quentin leading the way on Penny, the unusual procession set out for the Kerrigan ranch as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The journey took longer than usual with the wagon and tired children, and night had fully descended by the time the silhouette of Quentin's cabin came into view. He lit lanterns to illuminate the modest structure and the nearby barn, acutely aware of how the place must appear to his guests functional but devoid of comfort, a dwelling rather than a home. "It's not much," he said as he helped Amanda down from the wagon, her hand small within his calloused palm. "It's shelter," she replied simply, offering a smile that momentarily transformed her weary face. The children, despite their exhaustion, explored the cabin with interest while Abigail assessed it with a practical eye. "One room," she noted. "Where will you sleep, Mr. Kerrigan?" "Barn's comfortable enough this time of year," he said, already removing his few personal items from the cabin. "You folks take the cabin." That night, lying on a makeshift bed of straw in the barn, Quentin listened to the unfamiliar sounds of voices and movement from his cabin. For the first time in 2 years, the hollow feeling in his chest seemed less pronounced, filled instead with a strange mixture of anxiety and something that might, if he were honest with himself, be hope. Morning came with the sound of laughter, a sound so foreign to the ranch that it momentarily disoriented Quentin as he woke. Stepping outside the barn, he saw the twin girls chasing each other around the water pump while Amanda supervised, her face brightened by a smile. "Good morning," she called when she spotted him. "I hope we didn't wake you too early." "Sun's up. I should be up too," he replied, suddenly conscious of his rumpled appearance. Inside the cabin, he found Abigail at his stove, efficiently preparing breakfast from the meager supplies he had on hand. The scent of coffee and frying salt pork filled the small space, reminding him of mornings long past. "Your pantry's nearly bare, Mr. Kerrigan," she remarked without preamble. "And your roof has a leak above the corner bed." "Been meaning to fix that," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "James can help you," she said, nodding toward her son who was carefully setting the table. "He's good with his hands." Breakfast was a chaotic affair with 7 people crowded around a table meant for 2, but Quentin found he didn't mind the elbows and spilled milk and constant chatter of the children. He watched as Abigail efficiently managed the meal, her manner stern but not unkind, while Amanda engaged even the shyest child in conversation. After breakfast, Quentin reluctantly prepared to check on his cattle. "I need to ride out to the herd," he announced. "They're grazing what little grass there is about 3 miles west." "How many head?" Abigail asked practically. 35, he admitted. "Used to be hundreds before the drought." She nodded thoughtfully. "James and I will come with you, we know cattle." Before he could protest, she had organized the day Amanda would stay with the younger children and attend to the cabin, while Abigail and James would accompany Quentin to the herd. As they rode out, Quentin on Penny, Abigail on her own mare, and James on a gentle gelding borrowed from Quentin's small stable, he found himself impressed by the boy's confident handling of the horse and Abigail's straight-backed posture in the saddle. "Your husband taught you to ride?" he asked as they crested a hill overlooking the dry pasture land. "My father," she corrected. "He believed his daughters should be as capable as sons. It scandalized the neighbors, but it served us well. When they reached the cattle, Quentin was surprised by Abigail's immediate assessment. "They're undernourished but not starving yet," she said, eyeing the herd critically. "The grass here is gone, though. They need to be moved." "Moved where? The whole county's dry as dust." She pointed to a distant line of trees. "There must be water there, and where there's water, there's better grazing. Have you tried that area?" Quentin hesitated. "That's the edge of my property. Beyond is Taylor land, and Silas Taylor isn't known for sharing." "Is there a fence?" "No, but then there's no harm in letting the cattle find their own way to better grass," she said decisively. "If Taylor complains, you can apologize and move them back." Her pragmatism was both infuriating and refreshing. Before he could argue further, she and James had begun herding the cattle toward the tree line with impressive skill. Quentin had no choice but to join them, marveling at how naturally the boy anticipated the movements of the herd. By mid-afternoon, the cattle were contentedly grazing on greener pasture near a small stream that marked the property boundary. As they sat in the shade, resting before the ride back, Quentin found himself studying Abigail's profile against the backdrop of sun-dappled leaves. "You've done this before," he observed. "Cattle were part of our farm in Missouri," she replied, watching James, who was skipping stones across the narrow stream. "We had a small herd, nothing like what you once had, but enough to know the business. And what happens now for you and your sister?" "California still," she sighed, the first sign of uncertainty he'd seen in her. "I don't know. California was Robert's dream more than mine, but we need land, a fresh start. The children deserve stability." "There's land available around here," Quentin said tentatively. "Not as fertile as California maybe, but easier to reach with 5 children in tow. Land requires money, Mr. Kerrigan, something we have precious little of at the moment." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt with practical motions. "We should head back before Amanda thinks we've abandoned her." The return journey was made in companionable silence, broken only by James's occasional questions about the wildlife they spotted or the distant mountains. By the time they reached the ranch, the afternoon was waning, and Quentin was surprised to find himself reluctant for the day to end. Amanda greeted them in the yard, her face flushed from work but smiling. "You're just in time. Dinner's nearly ready, and wait until you see what the girls and I discovered." She led them around to the back of the cabin where a small vegetable garden, long neglected but not entirely dead, had been partially cleared of weeds. Young tomato plants, struggling but alive, had been carefully staked and watered. "I had no idea this was here," Quentin admitted, staring at the patch of earth that Mariah had once tenderly cultivated. "It was overgrown," Amanda explained, "but the structure was still there, the beds, the irrigation channels. Someone put a lot of love into this garden once." "My wife," Quentin said quietly. "She died 2 years ago." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Amanda's eyes softened with understanding, while Abigail's face remained carefully neutral, though something in her posture eased slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss," Amanda said gently. "As we are for yours," Quentin replied, looking at Abigail, who acknowledged his words with a slight nod. That evening, as they ate the simple meal Amanda had prepared, the conversation flowed more freely. The children, growing accustomed to Quentin's presence, peppered him with questions about ranch life, the mountains, and whether he had ever fought Indians or outlaws. "The West isn't quite as wild as those novels make it out to be," he told them, smiling despite himself at their wide-eyed interest. "Most days it's just hard work and hoping for rain." Later, after the children had been tucked into makeshift beds and the sisters sat mending clothes by lamplight, Quentin found himself lingering in the cabin rather than retreating to the barn. The domesticity of the scene both ached with familiarity and sparkled with newness. "You'll be moving on soon, I expect," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. Abigail's needle paused mid-stitch. "We should. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's no imposition," he said quickly. "In fact, I was thinking. My herd needs tending and this place needs work. I could use help, at least until you decide your next move. Room and board plus a small wage." The sisters exchanged another of their silent conversations before Amanda spoke. "That's very generous, Mr. Kerrigan." "Quentin," he corrected. "And it's not generosity, it's practicality. You need time to plan, I need help, simple as that." "We'll stay then," Abigail decided, her voice revealing nothing of her thoughts. "For a while." A while turned into 2 weeks, then a month. The rhythm of ranch life adjusted to accommodate the presence of the Jones sisters and their children. Mornings began earlier, with more purpose. The cabin, scrubbed and rearranged under Amanda's gentle direction, began to feel like a home again. The garden flourished under her care, yielding small but precious vegetables to supplement their meals. Abigail proved herself as capable with cattle as she'd claimed, joining Quentin each day to tend the herd, which gradually regained some of its lost condition, thanks to the better grazing. James shadowed them, soaking up knowledge of ranching with an eagerness that reminded Quentin of his own youth. The younger children found their places too. The twins, Emma and Elizabeth, became self-appointed egg collectors, carefully gathering the output of Quentin's small flock of chickens each morning. Sarah, quiet and observant, revealed a talent for spotting wildlife and reading weather signs that even Quentin found impressive. Little David, once shy around the tall rancher, now demanded to be lifted onto Penny's back whenever Quentin returned from checking the herd. One evening in late summer, as Quentin sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Amanda joined him, offering a cup of coffee. "The children are asleep," she said, settling beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "Even Abigail's resting." "She pushed herself too hard today. She always does," Quentin observed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Never met anyone so determined." Amanda smiled softly. "She's had to be. Our parents died when we were young and she practically raised me. Then her husband turned out to be less reliable than hoped, and now this journey." "And you?" Quentin asked, suddenly realizing how little he knew of her story. "Your husband, what was he like?" A shadow crossed her face. "Michael was kind when he was sober, but that wasn't often enough." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "His death was hard on the children, but not entirely unexpected. He'd been hunting drunk before." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this painful history touched something in Quentin. Without thinking, he covered her hand with his own. "I'm sorry." She looked up at him, surprise giving way to something warmer in her expression. "Life's full of unexpected turns, isn't it? A month ago we were stranded in St. Elmo with no prospects. Now here we are, watching the sunset on a cattle ranch." "A struggling cattle ranch," he reminded her with a wry smile. "For now," she said confidently. "But I've been reading your ledgers, hope you don't mind, and with some adjustments, there's no reason this place can't thrive again." He raised an eyebrow. "You've been studying my accounts." She blushed slightly. "I taught school briefly before I married. Numbers make sense to me." She hesitated, then added, "I've drawn up some calculations if you'd care to see them." Later that night, poring over Amanda's neat figures by lamplight, Quentin found himself both impressed by her insight and moved by her investment in the ranch's future. She had outlined a plan for increasing the herd gradually, maximizing the usable grazing land and potentially adding crops that could withstand the dry conditions. This would take years, he said, looking up from the papers to find her watching him anxiously. Yes, she admitted. It would. The implication hung between them years that they didn't have together, given the temporary nature of their arrangement. I thought you were bound for California, he said carefully. Plans change, she replied simply, holding his gaze. Before he could respond, a commotion from outside shattered the moment. Abigail's voice called urgently for Quentin, and they rushed to the door to find her pointing to the horizon where an ominous orange glow lit the night sky. Fire, Quentin said grimly, already reaching for his hat and rifle. Wake the children. If it shifts this way, you'll need to be ready to evacuate. I'm coming with you, Abigail declared, already pulling on her boots. Someone needs to stay with the children, he argued. I'll stay, Amanda volunteered. Go, be careful. Quentin and Abigail rode hard toward the blaze, which was consuming the dry brush about 2 miles from the ranch house. As they drew closer, they could see other figures silhouetted against the flames, neighboring ranchers who had also spotted the danger. It's headed for the creek, Silas Taylor shouted when he spotted Quentin. If we can contain it there, it won't reach the grazing land. For the next several hours, Quentin, Abigail, and a dozen other ranchers and townspeople fought the wildfire with desperation. They dug fire breaks, beat back flames with wet blankets, and drove panicked wildlife away from the advancing wall of fire. Abigail worked alongside the men without complaint, her face streaked with soot, her determination unwavering. As dawn broke, the fire was finally contained, though several acres of brush and a small section of forest had been lost. Exhausted, Quentin and Abigail made their way back to the ranch, their clothes reeking of smoke, their lungs raw from the effort. They found the ranch untouched, with Amanda and the children waiting anxiously in the yard. Little David broke away from his mother's grasp and ran to Abigail, wrapping his arms around her legs with relief. We're fine, Abigail assured them, lifting her nephew despite her exhaustion. The fire's contained. It didn't reach the cattle. Thank God, Amanda breathed, her relief palpable as she embraced her sister. To Quentin's surprise, she then turned and embraced him as well, her arms encircling his waist with unexpected strength. I was so worried about both of you. For a moment, he allowed himself to hold her, to feel the warmth of human contact that had been absent from his life for so long. When she stepped back, her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were steady on his. You both need rest, she said practically. I've got breakfast ready and hot water for washing. Later, clean and fed but still bone-weary, Quentin found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The events of the night, the fire, the community coming together to fight it, Amanda's arms around him swirled in his mind, disrupting the careful isolation he had constructed around himself. A soft knock at the barn door roused him from his thoughts. Abigail stood there, her expression serious in the afternoon light. We need to talk, Quentin, she said, using his first name for the first time. He gestured for her to enter, and she sat on a hay bale opposite his makeshift bed. For a long moment she studied her hands, then looked up with characteristic directness. Amanda showed me her plans for the ranch, she began. They're good plans, sound. They are, he agreed, uncertain where this conversation was leading. She cares for you, Abigail continued bluntly. I've seen it growing these past weeks, and I believe you care for her too. Quentin's throat tightened. I've not spoken of such things to her. No, you wouldn't. Abigail's smile was surprisingly gentle. You're both too careful with your hearts. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. I'm not one for flowery speeches, Quentin. I'll say it plain. My sister deserves happiness, So do you, and so do all our children. What are you suggesting? That we make this arrangement permanent, she said simply. You need help with this ranch. We need a home. Together, we could build something good here. Are you proposing on your sister's behalf? He asked, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. I'm being practical, she countered, though her own lips twitched with amusement. But the rest is up to you. She stood to leave, pausing at the door. One more thing. If you do decide to speak to Amanda, don't wait too long. Life's too short for hesitation. We've all learned that lesson the hard way. With that, she was gone, leaving Quentin with thoughts that kept him awake far into the evening. By nightfall, he had made his decision. He found Amanda alone in the garden, harvesting the day's ripe tomatoes in the fading light. She looked up as he approached, her smile warming her entire face in a way that made his carefully prepared words vanish from his mind. I thought you'd be resting, she said, setting aside her basket and brushing soil from her hands. Couldn't sleep, he admitted, coming to stand beside her. Too much thinking to do. About the fire, about the future, he corrected. This ranch's future, my future. He took a breath, then added, perhaps our future if you're interested in such a thing. Her hands stilled and she looked up at him with cautious hope. What exactly are you asking, Quentin? I'm asking if you'd consider staying. Permanently. The words came easier now, flowing from a place in his heart that had been closed off for too long. Not just as a hired hand, but as my wife, if you'd want that. Her eyes widened, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he had misread everything. Then she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her face. I would want that very much, she said softly. But what of Abigail and the children? They're part of the package, he said firmly. This place needs all of you. I've come to need all of you, though in different ways. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his own. I never expected to find a second chance at happiness, Amanda. But then you and your sister brought laughter back to this land, and somehow it began to heal. She stepped closer, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. We found our second chance here too. All of us. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like the first drops of rain after a long drought, a promise of renewal, of life continuing despite past sorrows. When they finally broke apart, they found themselves observed by 5 children and 1 amused sister, all watching from the edge of the garden with varying degrees of delight and embarrassment. Does this mean we're staying forever? Emma asked hopefully. Yes, sweetheart, Amanda answered, her eyes not leaving Quentin's face. If that's all right with everyone. The chorus of approval from the children was immediate and enthusiastic, while Abigail simply nodded her satisfaction at the arrangement she had helped orchestrate. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in St. Elmo's small church, with half the county in attendance. The community that had come together to fight the fire now gathered to celebrate new beginnings, bringing food and gifts and good wishes for the unconventional family. Quentin, standing beside Amanda as they exchanged vows, felt a lightness he had thought lost forever. Later, at the reception held on the ranch, he watched as Abigail directed the festivities with her usual efficiency. The children ran laughing between groups of guests, and Amanda moved through it all with a quiet joy that matched his own. That night, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Quentin found himself alone with his new wife on the porch where they had first begun to acknowledge their feelings. Above them, stars scattered across the vastness of the Colorado sky, and in the distance, a faint rumble of thunder promised what the drought-stricken land had been waiting for. Listen, Amanda said, her head resting against his shoulder. Is that thunder? He confirmed, his arm tightening around her. Real thunder, not just the teasing kind. As if in answer to his words, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, striking the dry earth with audible taps. Within moments, the sprinkle had become a steady shower, the blessed sound of rainfall on the roof bringing them both to their feet in wonder. "Rain," Amanda whispered, extending her hand beyond the shelter of the porch to feel the cool drops on her skin. "Real rain." Quentin pulled her into his arms, her face upturned to his, radiating happiness. "It's a good omen," he said, believing it with his whole heart. "A new beginning." "For all of us," she agreed, rising on tiptoes to kiss him as the rain fell steadily around them, washing away the dust and sorrow of the past, nourishing the seeds of their future together. Over the following years, the Kerrigan ranch flourished under the combined efforts of Quentin, Amanda, and Abigail. The cattle herd grew steadily, the garden expanded, and the once quiet cabin echoed with the sounds of family life. James, now a teenager, became Quentin's right hand in ranch operations, while Sarah revealed a talent for horsemanship that matched her mother's. The twins, with their boundless energy, became known throughout the county for the produce they sold from Amanda's expanding garden. And little David, no longer so little, followed Quentin like a shadow, absorbing every lesson about ranching with keen interest. Abigail eventually married the town's widowed blacksmith, a quiet man named George Miller, who adored her directness and strength, though she maintained her involvement in the ranch operations. The extended family celebrated the arrival of Quentin and Amanda's daughter, Rebecca, 3 years after their wedding, completing their circle of love and connection. In time, the story of the Kerrigan Ranch became something of a legend in St. Elmo, how 2 sisters had brought life back to a dying property, how laughter had returned like rain to parched land, how love had flourished in the most unexpected circumstances. But for those who lived it, it wasn't legend but simply life-challenging and joyful, ordinary and miraculous, sustained by love and strengthened by the bonds of family they had created together in the heart of the Colorado wilderness.